I want to thank everyone who's tuning in tonight. My name is Sam Mace. I'm the Inland Northwest Director for Saber Wild Salmon Coalition. And I'm based in Spokane, Washington, where I've been working on the Snake River issue for a long time now, for a couple decades over here. And a lot of my work is involved in, talking with folks in Eastern Washington, talking with sport fishers, people who love to fish and, value the fish over here, and also doing outreach to farmers and other stakeholders to find that common ground of how we can get and restore our fish and find, modern ways of getting grain to market and replacing the benefits of the 4 lower Snake River dams. And there's a lot of exciting work happening on that front right now. But I grew up in a coastal fishing town. I grew up on the coast of Oregon, near Coos Bay, Oregon, and grew up with a community that also very much loved and valued salmon and steelhead. And the big part of our economy was fishing. And it was just a huge part of our way of life there. And also a way that a lot of people took care of their families and did subsistence fishing, right, to make ends meet. And it was a huge part of our culture there. And so I kind of also come to it from that perspective. And one of my interests has been to kind of finding ways of building that bridge between the fishermen on the coast, people who value fish on the coast, and the farmers here in Eastern Washington. Because we've had food producers kind of pitted against each other, across a watershed, when in fact they have a lot in common, and there are solutions out there to keep wheat and wild salmon on our plates. And so I'm really excited tonight to be moderating a panel and discussion about the of Columbia Snake River salmon to the coastal communities, because those fish tie Eastern Washington to Western Oregon, Western Washington, and Alaska. And it is the common thread that's running through all our communities, east and west. And so I'm gonna keep my comments short here and get going with our panelists. The one thing I will say is that it's a really important, critical time right now on this issue. We have a real opportunity ahead of us if we can all work together to truly restore these fish and remove the 4 lower Snake River dams and replace their benefits. And there's been lots of movement happening. There's been stakeholder discussions and a process led by Washington Governor Inslee. There's been more of a call from sport fishermen and people who depend on salmon and steelhead over here in Eastern Washington and Idaho to call for some leadership. And we've had the governor of Oregon saying, speaking up about the need to bring people together. And even in Idaho, the governor has put together a salmon task force. So there is this movement happening that we can take advantage of and build momentum with, and really kind of solve this crisis we have. Tonight we have 2 speakers. The first one is Elizabeth Herendeen, and she is with Salmon State up in Alaska, and she's been working on Pacific salmon conservation issues for the last 15 years, beginning in Portland, Oregon with Trout Unlimited. And in 2007, she moved to Juneau in Southeast Alaska, where she's been working to protect Alaska's wild salmon and wild places ever since. And today she works for Salmon State and engages commercial fishermen, seafood consumers, and others in some of Alaska's biggest salmon conservation issues, including the Pebble Mine threatened Bristol Bay. And we also work with Elizabeth on the Alaska snake and the Columbia snake, and she'll be touching on that. Our second speaker is Joel Kawahara, a longtime board member of my coalition, Saber Wild Salmon, which is a coalition of commercial fishermen, sport fishing groups, conservation organizations, and others working to restore healthy, harvestable numbers of salmon and steelhead in the Columbia Snake River Basin. And Joel's been a longtime board member. He also represents Coastal Trollers, which is a fishing organization. And he fishes up and down the coast. And I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that when he gets going on his presentation. But if everyone is ready, I think I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth right now. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you, Sam. And just thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share some of what's going on here in Alaska. As Sam mentioned, I'm based in Salmon State's Juneau office, and we're a Alaska-based nonprofit, and our mission is to ensure that Alaska's wild salmon and the people who depend on those salmon continue to thrive, and really to make sure that Alaska remains a salmon state for generations to come. A lot of our work is focused on protecting salmon habitat. As we've learned in the Northwest and other parts of the US and the world, we can't have healthy wild salmon without the habitat that they need to thrive. So that's really where we focus. Now I am going to attempt sharing my screen. So just bear with me here while we transition. So as I mentioned, Salmon State, our mission is to make sure Alaska remains a salmon state. And as I was also saying, we really focus a lot on protecting salmon habitat and the wild places that salmon need. And Alaska in many ways is our last chance to do things right the first time. And again, a lot of lessons in the Northwest and elsewhere, and we're learning that the cost of recovery it's huge. And so it's, just makes sense economically to protect what we have while we still have it. So, we really take that to heart up here in Alaska. Today, what I'm going to share with you all is we're going to go to two different corners in Alaska. We're going to start in Southwest Alaska in Bristol Bay, where I spend a lot of my time and energy. And then we're also going to visit Southeast Alaska and talk about how, there's many connections between the Northwest and just the US as a whole, and places like Southeast Alaska and Bristol Bay. And if you follow the fish, you quickly realize why, in the end, we very much are all connected. But I want to start with Bristol Bay for a few reasons. I think what's happening in Bristol Bay is it's really important for anyone who cares about the future of wild salmon. It's, and we'll get into the specifics of that, but I just think it relates to what's happening in Southeast Alaska and the Columbia River system in a big way, because it's, we have commercial fishermen really fighting for their livelihoods, for their families, for their communities. And, in Bristol Bay, they're fighting to protect what they still have. They're fighting to protect pristine ecosystems and a thriving fishing economy. And so it's just, I think, a really interesting contrast for us all to reflect on and also to all engage in, especially right now as some of these decisions are playing out. So we're going to travel to Bristol Bay. It's maybe a couple hour flight from Anchorage. You can't get there by road, so you've got to fly there or get there by boat. Bristol Bay has been inhabited by Alaska Natives for thousands of years, but is largely undeveloped and really a fully functioning, intact ecosystem. And I think it's just a good reminder of what's possible, and when we do protect salmon habitat, and, a reminder of what fully functioning ecosystems look like. And hopefully that can be inspiration for restoration efforts in the Northwest and elsewhere. But Bristol Bay, it's really all about salmon. I mean, salmon has just shaped the region, the ecosystems, feeds the wildlife there. And it's really fed the people of Bristol Bay, like I said, for thousands of years. And, many families in Bristol Bay still live a subsistence lifestyle. So, they really depend on salmon as their primary source of protein. And they spend their summers putting up that fish, and that fish will get them through the winters. So salmon is really, really important for just their diet, as well as their culture and native traditions. And Bristol Bay is also a world-class sport fishing destination. People come from all over the world to get a chance to fish for Bristol Bay salmon and trophy trout as well. And, just sort of a trip of a lifetime. Bristol Bay is home to 2 national parks, Katmai National Park, as well as Lake Clark National Parks. So just, really world-class sport fishing and recreation to be had. And really, it's the commercial fisheries, though, that drive the economy up there. I mean, it's just, we're talking just tens of millions of sockeye salmon that return every summer and are harvested sustainably. And I think that's where Bristol Bay is just such a success story when it comes to not only habitat conservation, but also sustainable fishery management. It's a very large commercial fishery that employs over 14,000 fishermen and seafood workers, generates over $500 million in income and 1.5 billion in economic activity every year. So really, a true renewable economic engine that keeps the region going and also keeps the state of Alaska going. But it also is an important part of the Northwest economy too. A lot of Bristol Bay salmon makes its way down to cities like Seattle, where you have chefs like Tom Douglas serving it on their menus. You have a lot of the major seafood processors in Bristol Bay based in Seattle, as well as all the distribution companies and all the other industries involved in the seafood industry. So there's just a lot of money flowing as a result of the tens of millions of sockeye salmon returning to Bristol Bay year after year. Unfortunately, all of this is at risk, and we are on the brink of potentially losing what we have in Bristol Bay. Again, I think that's part of why I wanted to highlight this tonight, because it's just such an important opportunity to not repeat history and to learn from mistakes we maybe have made elsewhere. But for those of you not familiar with the proposed Pebble Mine, it's an issue that we've been fighting for over a decade now, and it would be one of the world's largest open pit gold and copper mines in the headwaters of Bristol Bay's most productive salmon spawning rivers and streams. And the habitat up there is just so incredibly sensitive and productive and truly irreplaceable. Over the years, it's been a bit of a roller coaster in trying to keep the mine out of Bristol Bay. Thanks to a really diverse and unprecedented coalition spearheaded by Bristol Bay tribes and commercial fishermen, we've made some real progress over the years in keeping the proposed Pebble Mine out of Bristol Bay. During the Obama administration, some of you may remember that the EPA began a process under the Clean Water Act that would have protected Bristol Bay's headwaters from the Pebble Mine. Unfortunately, though, in 2017, during the Trump administration, those proposed protections were reversed. And that soon after that, the Pebble Limited Partnership, which is really a Canadian-based mining company, submitted a permit application to the US Army Corps of Engineers. And that really started the clock and the process that we've been in the last few years, with the Army Corps going through an environmental impact statement process, an EIS, which I know you all are familiar with there in the Columbia and Snake River system. But we, the last few years, have been submitting comments, participating in public hearings, and really trying to make our concerns and questions known to decision makers as well as to the Army Corps. And unfortunately, this permitting process has been really rushed. Science has been ignored and dismissed. And there's real concern amongst us all that the Army Corps of Engineers will simply rubber stamp the Pebble Mine's permit application. despite all the well-documented science clearly showing that salmon and large-scale mining cannot coexist. A few weeks ago, there's been some interesting twists and turns. Some of you may have seen headlines just in national news that some secret videos were revealed called the Pebble tapes. And those videos revealed that the mining company behind the Pebble mine, has really been lying to Alaskans and Americans and the Army Corps, as well as Congress, about what their true mine plans are. And the mine that they've proposed to the Army Corps, is really just their foot in the door. And their plan is to develop a much bigger mine and really a mining district in Bristol Bay's headwaters. So it's really concerning in some ways, but also reaffirming to know that, we, for years have been saying that Bristol Bay needs to be off limits and it's the wrong mine in the wrong place. And I think these Pebble tapes really show that the Army Corps and the Pebble Limited partnership maybe don't have the best interests of the Bristol Bay region in mind, and are certainly not looking out for the fishermen who depend on those fish every year. So we're kind of in an interesting limbo position right now. And I think it's really just just a matter of weeks before we potentially see the Army Corps of Engineers make a final permitting decision and release a final record of decision. So it's a really important time, and just encourage you all to keep your eyes and ears open, because this is an issue that affects not only Bristol Bay's thousands of fishermen and Native communities, but it really affects anyone in this country who enjoys eating wild salmon and values wild salmon. And I'll close there because I realize tonight is not about Bristol Bay, but I do bring this story up and, bring this issue up because I think there's a few important things that from it. One, I think it's an example of what's possible when you have unlikely allies coming together around a shared goal. And it's been really incredible to see commercial fishermen, sport fishermen, subsistence fishermen, all coming together when, usually they're not in agreement on things and they're fighting over who's catching whose fish, but they've really come together. And it's, I think we've been able to accomplish an incredible amount over the years because of those partnerships and those relationships that have formed. So unlikely allies, a really powerful force for all of us, I think. And again, I think Bristol Bay is an important opportunity to learn from the past and not repeat what we've done elsewhere. We know that salmon need healthy habitat. We know they need clean water. We know that dams are not a good thing for healthy salmon populations. So, Bristol Bay is just an important, really critical time for us to say some places are off limits to certain activities and development. And we really need to all be saying that together. And I think the last point that I'll make with Bristol Bay is just, the role of commercial fishermen has been really important in this region. And that's a theme we're seeing in other regions too, including Southeast Alaska. And just, I think a lot of people assume that commercial fishermen just care about catching fish, but they have a real relationship with those fish, and fishing for them, it's not just a source of income, it's a source of identity and a source of community and culture, and a way to support their families. So fishermen have really become some of our most powerful advocates. We've flown them to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress and other decision makers. And it's really been fishermen who I think have helped sort of cut through the noise in DC and really get people's attention as far as why these wild places matter, why wild salmon matters. And I think that's something, we can leverage in other regions as well. So we're now going to travel to Southeast Alaska, where, we also are very fortunate to have incredible abundance of wild salmon, thanks to an abundance of really healthy wild salmon habitat and pristine ecosystems. In Southeast Alaska, we've got the Tongass National Forest, which is America's largest national forest and is really a salmon forest. And there's scientific evidence showing that salmon are in the trees. And if you haven't read Amy Gulick's book called Salmon in the Trees, I encourage you to check that out. In Southeast, we also have some very large transboundary rivers that originate in northern British Columbia. And again, these are all places that are pretty much undeveloped, and we don't have a lot of people and roads and things. And so these ecosystems really get to function how they have always functioned for thousands of years. And as a result, we have just incredible salmon populations. And similar to Bristol Bay, salmon has really shaped Southeast Alaska in many ways. You have Alaska Native communities who have lived there for thousands of years, sport fishing, and outdoor recreation is a huge part of the regional economy. But in Southeast Alaska, it's, salmon really drives the commercial fishing industry there, and salmon fisheries combined actually produce, more revenue than all the other fisheries in Southeast Alaska combined. So it's really about salmon in Southeast. And because of that, we've got some, real working waterfronts in places like Sitka and Petersburg and Juneau, and, commercial fishing is just a part of the community landscape and economy. And it's really about fishing families in Southeast Alaska. One thing that makes Southeast Alaska unique from other regions in Alaska is that you have a lot of commercial fishermen in Southeast who live in Alaska year round and live in Southeast specifically year round. In Bristol Bay, we have a lot of out of state permit holders and crew members who migrate to Bristol Bay every year for the salmon fishery and then leave. In Southeast Alaska, we don't have that as much. We do have some fishermen like Joel who travel up in the summers and then return home in the winters. But the majority of salmon permit holders in Southeast Alaska live there. And that's important because that's what really keeps our coastal communities going. Those resident fishermen are spending money in the community year round, whether it's for groceries or fuel or boat repairs, anything. That money, their money is staying local. And that's really important because in Southeast Alaska, it's very remote. We don't have a lot of other economic opportunities. It's really, the fisheries are what's kept our communities going for generations. And, it's the fact that we have different generations fishing together, I think is just so important for passing on fishing traditions and knowledge. And hopefully it's something we can continue in the future. And I don't want to focus on negatives here, but we can't take any of this for granted, whether it's in Bristol Bay or in Southeast Alaska. And I'm not going to get into the habitat threats we face in Southeast too much, but I do want to just note that it really is going to take I think real vigilance on all our parts, and to make sure that the habitat that our salmon depend on is protected. And Alaskans are responsible for that, but I think we all share responsibility in that, and making sure members of Congress and others are ensuring that the Tongass is not exempt from roadless rule protections, which is something we're that's happening right now as I speak. We're also seeing massive mines being proposed and developed in northern British Columbia. So trying to get Congress and the US State Department to be weighing in and making sure our salmon headwaters aren't turning into massive open pit mines. So, we can't take any of this for granted. And I think just reinforces we're at a really important moment when it comes to the future of Alaska salmon and the Northwest salmon as well. But I want to get into a little bit, some of the things that make Southeast Alaska salmon fisheries extra unique. In Bristol Bay, a lot of the salmon harvested in Bristol Bay originate in Bristol Bay. And in Southeast Alaska, it's a pretty different story where, as you can see in this map here, you've got salmon stocks, in Chinook largely, that originate in Washington State or in Oregon, because of their incredible migration out to the Gulf of Alaska where they feed and grow, on their migration back to the Northwest, they're swimming by, Southeast Alaska's fishing communities and fishermen. And similarly, you've got salmon originating in British Columbia that are swimming by out to the Gulf of Alaska and feeding and growing, and then swimming by Southeast Alaska on their way back. So because of that, you have these mixed stock fisheries. And I'll let Joel get into that more because this is, these are the fisheries he participates in. But what happens is fishermen in Southeast Alaska will intercept, is the word that's used, but they intercept the salmon that maybe originated in the Northwest. Some of those fish are intercepted by fishermen in Alaska. And so you have sort of this real mixed grouping of, it's hard to know where the fish are coming from. And it gets really complex really fast, of course. And so that's why in 1985, the Pacific Salmon Treaty was passed. And this international treaty between the US and Canada was an effort to address, how to co-manage these mixed stock fisheries where you have fishermen catching salmon that originated in another country. And ultimately the goal of the Pacific Salmon Treaty was to make sure both the US and Canada were getting equal benefits from the salmon that originated, in their natal grounds, natal waters, and also to make sure that commercial fishermen were allowing enough salmon to escape and, get by their fishing boats so that we had enough salmon returning to their natal waters to spawn and ensure, that we continue to have healthy salmon runs in the future. So the Pacific Salmon Treaty, it's a really important treaty. And I won't get into the details of how it works, but it's a very involved process, and it involves fishery managers, fishery biologists, representatives from both governments, meeting regularly and sharing data regularly to set catch limits and targets. And then, state and federal agencies work with fishermen at the local level to determine what the fishing season is going to look like based on target and total allowable catch. And, again, these numbers are based on, what's needed to ensure sustainable populations in the future. So it's Pacific Salmon Treaty. It's something we just often don't think about or hear about, but really important piece of policy that drives a lot of our fisheries in Southeast and in the Northwest. I'm not going to get into the details of this graph too much because that's, the overall point that I want to show here, though, is just despite the Pacific Salmon Treaty, we are seeing a decrease in the commercial catch of Chinook salmon in the troll fishery in Southeast Alaska specifically. And that's what this graph shows, over the last century or so. And, down in the lower right over here, it's getting worrisome because we're seeing the amount of Chinook harvested in Southeast Alaska go down, and commercial fishermen's, the catch ceilings they're given keeps going down. And so as a result, a lot of commercial fishermen in Southeast Alaska, their income is being slashed, and that means they're not able to repair their boats, or maybe they can't hire on extra crew, or maybe they need to start fishing in other fisheries. But, seeing this firsthand myself, it's the fishermen are having a harder and harder time to make a living and to support their families in Southeast Alaska. And I think another worrisome trend that's tied to the other graph I just showed is that we're seeing a decrease in the number of young fishermen entering Southeast Alaska's salmon fisheries and the troll fishery in particular. And we're seeing just the number of new participants and new, people buying permits and boats going down. And for a region, whose economy really depends on fishing and depends on salmon, I think this is just a really alarming trend, that affects us all, whether we live in Southeast Alaska or not. Because if we, ultimately, if we lose our commercial fishermen, we're losing a source of sustainable wild salmon. And, we're also losing, the advocates, the voices for wild salmon and the wild places that salmon need. So, I think it's about saving wild places to save wild salmon, but ultimately we're also needing to save our salmon fishermen too. And I think that's, one of the big takeaways here is that this is all very much connected. And we are all very much connected because of salmon, regardless of what stream is in our backyard or where we're getting our fish from. And so, I think salmon really, hopefully can continue to just bring us together. And hopefully, collectively, our combined voices, I think we can fight things like the pebble mine and win, or protect old growth forests and the Tongass. But, if we lose our commercial fishermen, we're going to lose our coastal communities, and with that, the incentive to protect these wild places. So I'll just close really quickly with, some specific things that people can be doing right now. I mean, whether it's the Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay, or protecting the Tongass in Southeast Alaska, or removing Snake River dams, and having a free-flowing system there again. I mean, I think Congress is really in a position to be helping wild salmon in a big way. The thing I didn't bring up is climate change. And that's just adding pressure to all of these different issues we're working on, whether it's the Snake River and trying to keep water temperatures low enough for salmon there, or up in Alaska, where we're also seeing rising water temperatures and declining salmon runs in some systems. I think Congress, we really need our members of Congress in the Northwest and in Alaska to carry our voices and, be ambassadors for salmon when decisions are being made about fishery management or habitat protection and resource extraction. So please contact your members of Congress. If you want more information about Salmon State, please go to our website, salmonstate.org. We have a lot of different more information about the different places we work and ways you can take action, and learn more about how to stay involved. And the last thing I'll just say too, every day just be thinking about, where you're getting your fish from. And, if you're on the fence about whether or not you want to buy wild salmon, just remember that, your dollars are a vote for, protection of healthy wild ecosystems. And also you're investing in fishing families and these rural communities that can thrive, but they depend on all of us to vote with our dollars and vote with our forks. So eat wild salmon. I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. Now we're gonna hand it over to Joel Kawahara, who's a fisherman, fishes up and down the coast, and is a board member of Saber Wild Salmon Coalition. And he can maybe explain too some more of the connections between Alaska and the lower 48. Alaska Trollers Association is a member of Saber Wild Salmon Coalition, for example, because of the impact the declines in Columbia snake salmon have on impacting Alaska fisheries up there. So we are really kind of all one salmon state. And with that, Joel, I hand it over to you.
Hi, is this loud enough, Sam?
It is for me. Hopefully it is for others, but keep speaking up.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that phenomenal presentation. I feel a little bit daunted following Elizabeth, but oh well. and this is, and I want to be thankful for the opportunity to discuss how and why fishing communities are restored in the involved in the restoration of Snake River salmon, Columbia Basin salmon too. Sam has some shots of a PDF to share, and the first shot she's going to show is a map from a 1949 Washington Department of Fisheries annual report that shows the amount of economic value from the total Columbia River run of salmon that came from the Snake River, which, there we go, and it'll be page 6 or something like that. As you'll see, in 1949, the Department of Fisheries was able to determined that over 50% of the value of salmon from the Columbia River came from the Snake Basin. Keep going down to 6. You'll see the map. It's kind of, well, it's an old faded document, but as far back as 1949, it was well known that the Snake, you'll see it says the Snake River produces over half of the total Columbia River fish run, and the text in this document very clearly describes the Washington Department of Fisheries opposition to the 4 lower Snake River dams because of the economic value that the Snake River provided to the Columbia River fisheries. I mean, that back then, that was the state sticking up for us because, as Elizabeth was pointing out, the fisheries, for Alaska, the fisheries are extremely economically important. For Washington State, post-war, the fisheries were hugely important. There's another page from that document that shows the economic value. That was the second page, I believe, in 1949. That's total fisheries, and I converted it someplace to. Dollars in 2020. Corrected it for inflation, and in 1949 they had $308 million of economic value in the fisheries, and corrected for inflation, that's $3.36 billion in 2020. Not all of that is salmon, I grant you, but in 1949, I will hazard a guess that at least half, if not 3/4 of that, was salmon. Value was in the salmon fishery. Canneries in the Columbia River area in Astoria were huge economic engines in Astoria and in the Columbia Basin, and those companies spent quite a bit of time going back to Washington, D.C., trying to combat these dams. Of course, they didn't have Woody Guthrie singing songs for them, so in the end, we ended up losing all of this economic activity. And as Elizabeth pointed out, it's a very strong moral story for people concerning the development of Bristol Bay, because back in the 50s and the 60s, when these dams were all being built, people were blathering on about, well, they can build hatcheries, they're going to put in fish ladders, the salmon will never know that the dams are there. And of course, fisheries have collapsed. As recently as 1967, there were over 3,000 individual fishing businesses on the Washington coast. They're salmon trolling businesses. There are currently about 125 licensed salmon trollers, catching about 10% of the Chinook harvested pre-1976, and almost none of the cohos. The brunt of this economic loss fell on the coastal communities, Ilwaco, Westport, LaPush, and Neah Bay, as well as inland ports, Port Angeles, Port Townsend, Bellingham, Anacortes, LaConner. I could name everybody in Puget Sound there, because they lost over $2 billion annual income. adjusted for inflation. The difference between 1949 and today, as we're all well aware, and what fishermen are still fighting about, is the degradation of salmon habitat across the Northwest. There are now over 400 dams, large and small, in the Columbia Basin. And as you know, the Puget Sound metropolitan area stretches from the Canadian border to Portland, and the Willamette Valley just burned last month. So, you know, there's not a whole lot of habitat left. Salmon and salmon fishermen have borne the brunt of these habitat degradation. Salmon fishing interests have been actively opposing the habitat loss, as was recognized a long time ago that salmon runs require cool, clean rivers. And I'll point out, salmon companies continue to oppose habitat loss. One of the pictures in Elizabeth's presentation was of the Seafood Producers Cooperative Dock in Sitka, Alaska. Their CEO, previous CEO, was a very strong promoter of habitat conservation in Southeast Alaska, and for little things, he actively opposed the usage of pesticides in U.S. Forest Service lands. Pesticides meaning herbicides for the clearing of herbaceous plants so that the conifers would grow back more quickly. And the guy wasn't a greenie. His previous position was in mineral management at Tyson Chickens in the Midwest. He had no connection to salmon whatsoever until he started at the Seafood Producers Cooperative. His members at the time were able to convince him of the vital importance of salmon habitat Southeast Alaska to his business. You know, I mean, we keep going on and on and on about salmon being business. It was true in Washington State. It's marginally true now, and it was very important, and it is still very important in Alaska. So the connection between Alaska and the Columbia River is by salmon. The North Pacific Ocean is kind of a giant salmon feedlot. Salmon from as far south as the Sacramento in California and all the way to the Yukon in Alaska mingle in the Gulf of Alaska. And we understand this from tag recoveries in organized surveys and by bycatch in trawl fisheries, and also by genetic stock identification. And since ocean fisheries began, as Elizabeth pointed out, Columbia Basin salmon have been present in the catch. In the troll fishery in Southeast Alaska, Columbia Basin salmon remains a major component of the fishery. And again, as Elizabeth noted, the overall management of harvest between Alaska, Canada, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho is contained in the Pacific Salmon Treaty. The objectives of the Pacific Salmon Treaty are to restore salmon stocks across the Northwest and Alaska by ensuring adequate spawning escapement and maintaining hatchery production. Even though the drama of the Pacific Salmon Treaty is the allocation, who gets to catch what, the nut of the whole thing is to make sure salmon spawning occurs in an optimal way in every region where salmon are produced, including the Columbia Basin. So salmon, you can say that commercial salmon trolling in Alaska is managed for Columbia River stocks. In fact, that's a very true statement. Let's see. So the salmon escapement goals in the Columbia Basin are set by local agencies, Washington Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, or Idaho Fish and Game, or the treaty tribes, the Umatilla, the Warm Springs, or the Yakima, or whomever. They all have a hand managing the salmon spawning, the Chinook spawning I'm mostly referring to in the Columbia Basin. Those numbers form the basis for the harvest management of salmon in Alaska, as well as in Washington State and in British Columbia. So if you're a fisherman in those other regions, you always have the obligation of contributing to the conservation of the stocks and the sustainability and perpetuation of those stocks by not taking them all before they can get to spawn. And also you have partners in the maintenance of the run and the sustainability of the run who are far away, who also deserve some of the harvest. That's all pretty sticky and emotional to do that sharing, but that's the connectivity between the Columbia Basin and Alaska, and hence the intense interest in Alaska, as well as in the Washington coast, for issues pertaining to the production and sustainability of salmon in the Columbia Basin. In addition, the Pacific Salmon Treaty also provides for the adherence to Endangered Species Act requirements on salmon fisheries in the ocean for the ESA listed Chinook from the Columbia Basin, primarily Snake River Fall Chinook, but also Lower Columbia River Chinook and Lower Columbia River Coho. So that's a lot of policy issues that, like Elizabeth said. And then lastly, I want to jump around just a little more and talk about the southern resident killer whale and the relationship of the ocean fishery to southern resident killer whale. And I understand there was an orca discussion last week, and I missed that webinar, and I apologize for that. And I think I want to recognize that the relationship between Chinook salmon in particular and southern resident killer whale is straightforward. Orca eat Chinook salmon. That's very clear. Excuse me. Less clear is the effect of ocean harvest on southern resident killer whales. The Pacific Fisheries Management Council has been looking at impacts from harvest on southern resident killer whale health metrics. Those include fecundity, overall population, and malnutrition manifested by our observations of peanut head or emaciation. The approach taken by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council Analytical Work Group to produce their risk assessment was to look for statistical relationships between annual abundance of Chinook in the October to May time period in the ocean and those three health metrics. They found no statistically significant relationships between the southern resident killer whale health metrics and the salmon abundance in the wintertime between October and May. They did find one or two instances where the relationship of southern resident killer whale trends and trends in salmon coincided, but it wasn't statistically significant. The lows in salmon abundance actually coincided with dips in the southern resident killer whale population, but recently there have been increases in salmon abundance in the last 10 years that did not coincide with increases in southern resident killer whale. It was kind of, it was pretty unsatisfying for everybody that wanted to find something that they could do for southern resident killer whale that was tangible and provable. Kind of the lack of clear statistically valid relationships between salmon and southern resident killer whale is likely due to the very nature of the southern resident killer whale diet. The preference is for Chinook, as far as we know, but when there aren't any Chinook around, they'll scrounge around apparently, and maybe they won't get enough to eat so that they're good. There's good reproduction, but they can maintain themselves as large apex predators. So it's that confounded finding a statistical relationship between the Chinook fishery and the southern resident killer whale. For instance, the prey switching, it's known that J-pod consumes both coho and chum salmon in the fall. Like around now, the Chinook have all retreated to the river to spawn. Coho are just finishing their spawning run through Puget Sound. J-pod's out here eating the last of the coho and the beginning of the chum run. And there have been fecal samples that have shown that there's lingcod and halibut most notably, and some other fish. But southern resident killer whales would undoubtedly do better in a more robust system. So really the message I drew from that is that the ocean ecosystem and the climate change that is affecting the ocean ecosystem probably has as much to do as anything else for southern resident killer whale well-being. That's another issue that we need to work on. As far as taking action, the National Marine Fisheries Service is revising their biological opinion of the salmon fishery with regard to the southern resident killer whale status. The revised biological opinion will be informed by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council's risk assessment and recommendations on potential measures affecting the fishery, and the biological opinion is scheduled to be released or finalized in March of next year. So that's kind of stand by to see that biological opinion. Currently, for people that are interested, the November Pacific Fisheries Management Council meeting will be finalizing recommendations for conservation measures that they will be forwarding to National Marine Fisheries Service. And if people are interested, there's an opportunity for public comment there. And the documents are pretty nerdy, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to go take a look at those. And of course, feel free to comment. So that's everything I had. So I think we were told to stand by to answer questions. So I'm standing by.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. And we've been answering some of the questions, the short ones just in the Q&A, but I did want to give you a chance, Joel, to respond to a couple of them. One of the questions was from the Orchid Conservancy was that I've heard that pink hatchery salmon impact the Chinook numbers. Is this true? And if yes, what is the connection? Studies also show that when pink hatchery salmon are prevalent, southern residents suffer. And Elizabeth did like quick answer on it that she'd seen similar studies in Alaska, but I wondered if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Elizabeth, did you have a comment?
She
No.
wrote, yeah, she wrote one, Joel, but I was just seeing whether you wanted to.
So to the best of my knowledge, the study that was, the only study that I'm aware of is done looking at Puget Sound pink salmon. There are no pink salmon hatcheries in Puget Sound. They're all natural production. And the correlation that Greg Ruggiero, the lead author, found was that on even years, when the odd year spawning pink salmon juveniles entered Puget Sound prior to the Chinook, they could depress the food chain as they moved through Puget Sound. And then when Chinook salmon came out a month or two later, there wasn't as much around for them to eat, and they fared less well for even year ocean entrancing Chinook. And there was also a possibility, and I think it was only speculation. I don't know if there's any NOAA observations to back it up, that pink salmon inhibited SRKW foraging, but I don't know that those results have been have spurred any action. And actually, my comment regarding pink salmon, both in southeast in Alaska and down here, well, pretty much everywhere, is that pink salmon, by coming back in bulk numbers, provide this really high level of ocean nutrients back to the watersheds where they're spawning, in a well-functioning watershed where there's retention of those nutrients, because there's a lot of trees. Elizabeth mentioned the salmon and the trees issue in southeast Alaska. Those nutrients are in the watershed, and they provide for the invertebrate nutrients that will feed in the future coho and Chinook juveniles as they spend their time in the river. So pinks are maybe not a good fit in decimated watersheds where there's concrete all around and all they do is gobble up food, but in a well-functioning watershed, they're pretty much essential, particularly in southeast Alaska. There's so much rainfall. As all gardeners know, nitrogen is highly mobile. It flushes right back into the ocean unless the trees retain it, or the bears. And they provide a service for the other fish that come and spawn in those rivers. If it wasn't for pink salmon, there'd never be any invertebrates for juvenile salmon to eat, other juvenile salmon to eat in southeast Alaska or any Alaskan stream. So it's a little bit dicey, and I think it's a fascinating ecosystem question that has so many facets. I think you'd have to be really careful get to an answer there, and I'd be extremely wary of taking any management actions that would look at reducing pink salmon, particularly the naturally spawning pink salmon in Puget Sound. That there'd have to be really good evidence that there would be any efficacy for SRKW. That's kind of long, but there you go.
Okay. And Joel, one person had it. She just wanted to make sure that you weren't saying that Chinook salmon numbers don't affect orca population health. I think you weren't saying that.
I'm not saying that. It is odd that the total number of Chinook in the last several years has been higher than, say, in the 1990s. The 1990s was kind of the Northwest's first really big and devastating El Nino period. Salmon stocks across the region crashed, and southern resident killer whale populations took a big crash in the 1990s. Since 2001, we've had a couple of periods of better than the 1990s salmon populations across the Northwest, and SRKWs haven't recovered out of the endangered listing over the 20 years since that happened. Now, that isn't all because of salmon populations. SRKW demographics, as experts will tell you, are a little bit different than maybe a fully productive population, number one. And number two, since the early 2000s, there's been an increase in whale watching and other traffic over the top of SRKW that may be influencing how they use salmon in the Salish Sea. It's extremely complicated, and so no, I didn't say increasing numbers of salmon won't benefit SRKW, but it is true that since salmon have been increasing since 2001, SRKW, for a myriad of reasons, haven't benefited or taken advantage of them. There's no doubt that more salmon available for SRKW will relieve one of the major stresses on them, but it might not be the only major stress that suppresses their population.
I urge folks who are really interested in that orca question to go back to our YouTube channel, Saber Wild Salmon. We've recorded all these presentations, and last week's with Dr. Sam Wasser was really enlightening. I learned a lot. I learned several things that I did not know before from that presentation. And he goes into all the different stressors on our orcas and the role like Chinook or lack thereof is playing in it. Do we have, I'll see if there's any more questions from anybody.
Sam, while you're looking, I'll just put a plug in for the Northwest Straits Foundation in Puget Sound. They too will be having an orca webinar next week on the 14th, I believe it is. But I'm sure the people from Orca Conservancy know about that, and check with the Orca Conservancy, or if you can remember Northwest Straits Foundation in the Salish Sea, and look for their seminar next week, which I'll be around for, and I'll be in.
Yeah. Okay. I love this question from Zoe. I live in Spokane, Washington, and I'm studying fisheries. How could I get involved? We can use all the help we can get here, Zoe, and you should reach out to either me, Sam, at wildsalmon.org, or Carrie at wildsalmon.org, and we can post our Spokane office emails and contact information here. We have a lot of really great projects happening here out of our office here. Thanks for your interest. And I assume maybe you're at Spokane Community College, maybe, or Eastern, or you could be at Eastern. Anyway, we have some great fisheries departments here. Well, maybe that's it. I think maybe we'll wrap up. Oh, wait, no, I got a couple more. Besides contacting legislators, what other actions can we take to best save salmon? We'll take a couple more questions before we wrap up. Joel or Elizabeth have anything to say on that?
I'm happy to do an initial response to that, and this kind of feeds into another question I see posted there about, as consumers, what other opportunities do we have to invest our dollars in not just sustainable wild salmon, but directly as, piece of fish, but through other purchasing decisions. And, I think it's exciting to see different certifications like Salmon Safe products and supporting businesses, whether it's a winery or someone else that is, changing their practices and products to be more salmon friendly, whether it's how they're using their land or what they're doing with their water. So I think looking for things like Salmon Safe products is a great way to be voting with your dollar, but also making a difference to help save salmon. When it comes to the minerals that are, there's growing pressure to develop the Pebble mine. And honestly, like, I didn't get into it very much, but, Pebble is just one of many mega mines being pushed in Alaska and in northern British Columbia. And I think as we see demand for renewable energy go up, and, there's more demand for copper. And with the potential companies that might be developing that on how to source their minerals from mines that are not destroying salmon watersheds. Those certifications don't exist yet. They are in the works. I mean, I know companies like Apple and others are thinking more about where they're sourcing their minerals from. So I think it's happening now. And that's where consumers can play an important role in helping, communicate that you don't want your iPhone to be, the cause of, losing a place like Bristol Bay or, other, really our last other salmon strongholds that we still have. But yeah, great questions though.
I'll just chime in there. I will say my very first job in high school was in a salmon farm, and it was horrible and disgusting. And I spent all day walking gangplanks, being covered in antibiotic laden feed. And I have not eaten, I do not eat farm raised fish. I go for wild. And I think that's one really important thing. When you eat sustainably caught wild fish, you are supporting the fishermen that we're working with and are so important in the coastal communities that are calling out for dam removal or calling out for bold action in the Columbia Snake River to restore these fish for everyone, for commercial fishermen, for sport fishermen, and for the tribal communities that have been hit the hardest. And I think, you can also buy Bristol Bay. In fact, I just smoked 2 Bristol Bay sockeye this past weekend in my smoker, and I order my salmon from a commercial fishing family up in Bristol Bay. So I'm supporting a fishing family that I know as opposed to Bristol Bay. But I'm a big salmon eater, so I get it in 50 pounds. You might not want 50 pounds, but you certainly can go into the store, your fish store, and ask be careful what you're buying. And when you go into restaurants, thanking them if they are serving sustainably caught fish, and then calling them out when they are serving Atlantic salmon at $25 a plate. It's like, why isn't this wild? But I think as consumers, we can have a lot of power. I think with that, I will wrap up, and just a huge thank you to our panelists and a huge thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. In the chat box, Carrie has posted some links for folks who want to know how to get more involved. We're doing a real big push to get people all over, across the country, especially here in the Northwest, contacting their elected leaders, urging them to take action on this issue and help us solve this crisis and move us in a path where we are replacing 4 aging dams with more modern alternatives so that we can get these fish back. And anyway, there's a lot to do, a lot of ways to get involved. Go to our website, wildsalmon.org. Go to salmonstate.org and support all the excellent work Elizabeth is doing. And thank our commercial fishermen like Joel, who do so much to protect this resource. So thanks a lot for coming.